Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a great week. This video will go over Chapter 17, which is about reporting on public affairs. What is public affairs? Well, it's really just issues that matter to the community. A lot of journalism involves two primary roles. It involves informing people about what's going on in the community and also acting as a watchdog for the community. You may have heard this term before. Watchdog journalism really means trying to investigate things to ensure that all aspects of the community are running as they should. If they're not, it's a journalist's job to expose those things and bring those bad things to light. And so that's why public affairs reporting matters. A lot of our government relies on journalism watchdogs and as well as providing information to the public. So the most popular type of public affairs reporting is crime. Crime, whether we like it or not, is actually extremely newsworthy. It matters to the community. It's interesting. It's often unusual. So it really plays on a lot of the news values that we have. Now, crime, we typically only report on crime that happens that's most unusual or most interesting. So for instance, if someone gets a ticket for jaywalking, that's not super interesting, unless they were jaywalking, in a chicken costume as a form of protest, against Tyson Foods or something. So, we're not going to report on all types of crime, only those that are either extremely unusual or those that really matter to the public. This is why homicides, thefts, things like that are actually some of the most popular crime stories reported, even though they don't happen as often as other forms of crime, such as speeding. We typically do report on traffic accidents. However, we usually only include those ones that include fatalities or deaths. Again, this is about the level of newsworthiness that a particular incident meets. We also report about department news in terms of crime, whether that's the sheriff's department or maybe a local police department. And this kind of goes into our watchdog role. We can look at investigations of officers, which obviously has been a major topic in the national news as of late. Locally, you would want to cover important promotions or retirements, especially in leaderships of crime departments, as well as community service, because as well as being a watchdog, we also need to help support government in some ways. So we don't want to just only show the negative side of police officers. There are many good officers out there. In fact, the good officers tend to outweigh the bad. So we don't want to paint this image that all officers are bad. So we want to promote some of the community service that they do and want to promote them as civil officers when they are acting in the appropriate manner. If they're not acting in the appropriate manner, though, that's when journalism as the fourth estate and the government watchdog really comes into play. So we need to report crime through both police documents or police reports and on-scene coverage. While it is possible to write an entire crime story without ever leaving the newsroom, and in fact, I've done this quite frequently, you really get the best crime news when you actually go out on the scene. Now, there are some caveats to on-scene crime reporting. Of course, you need to report safely. Your safety is top priority, more than getting a story. So if there is an active manhunt going on, you need to go to a location that officers say is safe for you to report on. You also need to listen to authorities. If they are telling you to back up or stand in a certain place, you need to do that because most of the time the authorities are trying to help protect you and keep you safe. Now, if you don't believe an officer is giving you proper instruction or they're trying to hide something from you, you really still need to listen to them because they have the ability to arrest you if you are on a crime scene and not following police orders. So unless you're willing to be arrested, you need to do whatever a police officer tells you while reporting on crime news. You can always go back through the proper legal channels after the event to ensure that that doesn't happen again if they're doing something, if they're telling you something that they shouldn't be. However, on scene in the moment is not really the time to fight it unless you want to be arrested. We also need to use police officers as sources because of the nature of watchdog journalism and investigative reporting. Police and reporters typically have an adversarial relationship, and yet it's also symbiotic because police often rely on the media to get out information to the public, and reporters really need police officers for sources of information. So while there is this hesitancy that most police officers have in speaking to the media, the more you can cultivate a relationship with your local community police force, the better off your crime reporting will be. So spend time with officers, treat them as real people. I know that sounds unusual for me to say, but a lot of times people will automatically assume that officers are bad or that, police are just abusing their power. If you really get to know a person on an individual level, it helps you to be able to work with them in a better professional relationship. You need to understand your public records laws as well. This is going to differ from state to state. Some states have better open record laws than others. Alabama is not known for being particularly open in the law's ability for journalists to see public records. But there are some states that have a very open record law. So know the area that you're working in and know the rights that you have in terms of getting access to police and other public affairs documents. Try to get a human source as often as possible. Again, I can write an entire crime story based on a police report, but it's often better to hear from an officer or a public information officer, a PIO, what really happened in their own words. So you want to try to speak to a person in the police force rather than going solely off a document. And you want to regularly check in with your sources. So typically when I was working as a producer, one of the first things I would do as I was sitting down and getting ready for the day is I would make what are called beat calls. And beat calls would be me calling every local police and sheriff's department in my DMA, which for, Birmingham is roughly 28 counties. So that is a lot of local offices, but that allows me to speak to the dispatcher, ask if there are any updates. I'm also kind of cultivating that personal relationship. So I'll ask them how they're doing. You treat them very nicely, and then they become regular sources of information for you. Now, beat calls are important for two reasons. First, it's a chance for you to know what happened over the course of the day. But it's also a way that you can build up a relationship so that when something happens, the police force will be more likely to reach out to you rather than you having to find it out yourself. So beat calls are very important practice for journalists. There are other sources of information for you in crime reporting. The first is going to be a scanner. Most public affairs organizations, such as fire departments or police departments, they're going to use a scanner or a radio service to report things that are going on. It's important for you to memorize certain 10 codes. And they may differ from department to department. But for instance, if I were trying to report, or if I were listening to the scanner for things to cover, I would be looking out for the 10 codes that mean, murder or homicide, so that if something were to happen, I would be able to cover that. So for instance, a 1031C, tends to be the 10 code for a homicide. See, I still even remember that from, 5 years ago of working because it's so ingrained in my head that I listen for the term 1031C. which suggests that someone has been killed. So there are many different 10 codes that you need to be looking out for. And of course, you need to know the ones that are particular for your area. Now, a blotter is a record of all calls made to the police department. Sometimes this falls into open records, sometimes it doesn't. But blotters tend to be very boring, but every once in a while, you'll find a really good story based off that. Incident reports are like the ones that you see on the right. It's also called an investigation report. And this is when the officer is writing notes about what happened. The problem with incident reports is they are written in police terms. So you can see this one here on the right uses a lot of abbreviations, a lot of shorthand terms. So you need to be able to read these and get familiar with cop speak. So affidavits and search warrants are good as well, because before a police department can arrest someone, they typically need an affidavit or a search warrant. And so that can give you good information to write your story about. Jail booking records, mugshots are actually usually considered public records. So another source that I would go to every day would be to go to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, and I'd click on their booking record, which is an online website, and I could see every single person that was arrested and get access to their mugshots as well as their charge. So those are good ways to find stories as well. Sadly, sometimes you have to look at autopsy reports or medical examiner notes. This especially happens with killings or various injuries. Arrest reports are obviously very important because they tell you who is arrested, what they were charged with, and the situation surrounding the arrest. Criminal history for suspects can often be informative if you have a suspect who has been involved in multiple crimes. Of course, if a police department or a police officer is undergoing an internal investigation, those documents are typically released to the public, although sometimes during an active investigation they will not be. But those can be very important in your role as a watchdog to ensure that officers are being held accountable for their actions. And then accident reports would be involving traffic incidents. So crime reporting is one of the very first things that most journalists do. It's typically the first beat that you will be given as a journalist, but it can be very difficult to cover crime, particularly because you're working with a lot of victims and families who've been affected by various tragedies. It is very emotional to speak to a victim or a family member, and a lot of times we need to approach that very gently. We need to be compassionate people more so than we need to be journalists. And I think sometimes, unfortunately, we forget this and put the story first. People are always more important than the story. So be careful that you're not re-traumatizing a victim by having them recall what's going on. Respect their boundaries. If you see them start getting uncomfortable, remind them that you can stop the interview at any time, or that they don't even have to participate in the first place. If a person has been victimized, it is their right to tell their story, and they get to decide if and when they tell it. So just be very cautious as you are working with victims and families. Something else I want to mention, and I think that this is going to be increasingly important for your generation of reporters, is vicarious traumatization. This is actually something that I research in depth within my work, but it suggests that because journalists are getting to crime scenes or, crisis or tragedies at the same time that police officers and firefighters and ambulance workers are, we often experience the same type of trauma that first responders do. I have been on scenes where children have been shot or raped, killed, and it is very difficult for you to handle that personally and professionally. So you need to ensure that you are using healthy coping habits in dealing with the trauma that you experience as a journalist, and try to work with a mental health professional I have disclosed to you guys that I have PTSD. Some of that is related to my work in journalism and the things that I experienced while working as a journalist. So I regularly see a counselor, even though I've been out of the industry for 5 years. I think it's really important for me to stay attuned to my mental health. And more journalists need to be embracing taking care of themselves, given all of the trauma that they experience on a daily basis. So, in terms of crime writing, one of the most important things is going to be your lead. Crime reports tend to be a lot shorter in terms of story length, but they need to pack a lot of information in very quickly. So, you're most likely going to be using a summary lead for crime reporting. The central point will be what makes the crime newsworthy, whether that's the amount of people that were killed, the amount of damages, the unusualness of the crime. So think about what makes this crime newsworthy. Why does it matter to the public? And that becomes your lead. You need to describe the specific crimes that were involved. And remember, this might be different than the legal charges. So someone may be charged with DUI, but if within that drunk driving incident, they damaged 15 mailboxes, that's maybe not going to be the legal charge, but that's going to be the crime, the aspect of the crime that makes it newsworthy, because now 15 families are having to replace mailboxes. In terms of describing criminals, it's very important that we are very aware of the potential for stereotypes. There's really no reason to report a suspect's race or religion unless it's relevant to the story. And the reason it would be relevant to the story is if it is a racial or religious hate crime, or if we are looking for a particular suspect, and one of the aspects of helping people identify that suspect would be their race. So be very cautious in reporting someone's race or religion because it can feed into negative stereotypes. Also, never consider someone guilty, even if they've been arrested, even if the police are telling you that the case is solid. They are innocent until the courts prove them guilty. So none of your language should suggest that the suspect actually did it. Instead, you can allege that they did it, and you can attribute any sense of guilt or sense that they did something to the proper officials. This is very, very important because this is one of the main reasons that journalists get sued for libel or slander. So you can be held legally responsible for saying someone did something, and then if they are found not guilty, that person can come back and sue not only your news organization, but you. Within your crime report, you need to include major facts such as deaths and injuries. You need to tell people the nature and value of damage done. You need to identify the suspect. And while we need to be careful of stereotypes, we also need to be clear enough not to have that suspect be confused with someone else. If your suspect's name is John Smith, you're going to have to provide more information about that suspect. So all the John Smiths out there are not considered falsely accused. You need to think about whether you want to identify the victim. This a lot of times comes down to respect, whether that victim wants to be identified or not. And typically, we will never identify sex crime victims. And you want to include what weapons were potentially used, any official charges that have been filed, and then tell the actual story about the crime and the arrest rather than just providing plain facts. Word choice is very important within crime writing. You need to be aware of legal terms. What's the difference between a misdemeanor and a felony? What's the difference between assault versus injury, things like that. So when you are writing about crime, you need to be very specific about the types of terms that you use. One thing to keep in mind is that police often use the term suspect and person of interest interchangeably, but we as journalists should not do that. This story written on the right is about investigators who have taken someone in for questioning. They are calling this person a person of interest in the murder of a 7-year-old girl. And so the assumption here is that the person that's being brought in for questioning by the Metro Homicide Unit is going to be the suspect, right? But that's not necessarily true because no arrests have been made. So they don't have enough of a case to charge this person. So therefore, we shouldn't make it seem like this person of interest is a suspect. So be very cautious in using the term person of interest. In fact, I would not use it at all. Also, be considerate of the language surrounding victims, such as receiving injuries. Receiving has a positive connotation. We actually suffer injuries. So again, just be very clear in your word choice with crime writing. There are many other types of public affairs cases that you'll be reporting on. We talked within speeches and meetings about city and county governments. Typically, the public affairs reporting will be done through meetings like city councils or county commission meetings. But it's also important to remember that we have school districts as well as universities that would be considered public affairs items. And then, of course, one of the most important aspects of public affairs, probably right behind crime reporting, is court reporting. However, we're not going to be covering that in this class. I don't expect you to report on a court case, but it's important that you kind of go over that information in the chapter, become familiar with it, and know that it is an important part of journalism. So now that you understand a little bit more about public affairs writing, you can use either crime reporting or school districts, university officials, or even city and local governments within your story ideas for your pitches for your print writing piece. Now, for this week, or today's module rather, you're going to be going into your discussion post and you will be doing an exercise on crime writing. In order to prepare for your AP exam next week, I've given you AP Review 5 homework. This is a replica of the AP exam. So it's going to be the exact same style, exact same format that you'll experience next week in the AP exam. So be sure to take that. It is 50 questions, but I wouldn't expect it to take longer than 30 minutes. I've had some guinea pigs run through this and the exam, and it took them no longer than 10 minutes. So know that you should give yourself plenty of time to do it, but hopefully it won't take a ton of time. Finally, your pitches for your print story, which is due on October 16th. Your pitches will be due no later than Monday, October 12th. If you do turn them in prior to that, I will be happy to grade them and approve them before that, so you can begin working on your story. So I highly suggest that you work ahead of Monday's deadline, but Monday is the last day that you can turn it in for credit. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, be thinking about your print story for next week and prepare yourself for your AP exam. Have a great weekend, everyone.